ourselves briefly so that maybe you get a little sense of how old we really are. Okay, go ahead.
I'm Lois Barrett. I live in Wichita, and I'm retired now from being professor of theology and Anabaptist studies at Anabaptist Mennonite Biblical Seminary in Elkhart. I had a long commute. But I have been working for the church in some capacity or another since 1971.
I'm Dorothy Nicole Friesen, born and raised in Minnesota, a Bethel College grad, and then for about 10 years I was a high school English teacher, so my first foray into teaching was as an English teacher. I do want to tell the short story that Patty Shelley was in my student teaching. When I was a senior at Bethel and did my student teaching at Newton High School, I taught English 11, and there were 3 young women who sat right in front of me every class session. They had all their study guides filled out. They had read every chapter, and when I asked a question, the hands just popped in the air. One of those 3 was Patty Shelley. She does not remember me, I remember her. And I thought, English teaching is going to be so fun. My first job was an 8th grade English teacher in a junior high, and I was not the most popular class. Ready? Thank you. I'm going to do a little bit of background to get us into 1972. Our book covers the years 1972 to 2006. We are documenting the first ordination of women in the United States and in Canada by the Mennonite Church of its various stripes at that time. So you have to get back there. So I thought I would ask you, how many of you were here at Bethel College Mennonite Church in 1972? Raise your hand. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So the rest of you, where were you? Welcome. But what was the role of women in the congregation you were at, if you were in church, in 1972? And I see some of these that may not have even been born. So think about your mother. What was happening in their church? What was happening in your church with women when you, in 1972? Just yell it out. Sunday school teacher. Head of the women's groups. Women should be silent. Choir director. Deacon's wife. I'm sorry, organist. Still wearing your coverings.
At the Eden Mennonite Church, women were not allowed to vote in church meetings.
Okay, in the Eden Mennonite Church in Mound Ridge, women were not allowed to vote in business meetings in 1972. 50 years ago. Did anybody in any of your churches in the 1972-ish era have a woman in a leadership position like deacon? Okay, Jane? Did we have a woman deacon? You were in 1972? Okay, there's Mountain Lake, you betcha. Then also the first ordination in the Mennonite Church, this is MC, Old Mennonite, was 1973, was Emma Richards in the Illinois Mennonite Conference, Lombard Mennonite Church. And then in 1976, Marilyn Miller was the first General Conference Mennonite Church ordination in Arvada, Colorado, Western District Conference. It's too small for you to see there, but I brought a framed McCall magazine cover or article 1920 or 21. Maybe you can see the title. It says Dangerous Women. This was given to me in my licensing for ministry by the Rainbow Mennonite Church in 1984 in Kansas City. If you have a chance, but carefully don't touch because it's very heavy and I've got it on, I think it'll stay. But all of these women were from the 1920s dealing with abolition issues, voting issues, and all of them were involved in some Protestant church activity, from translation of literature and Bible to voting. One of the women, when she got married, did not like the pastor's instruction about how to be a good wife, so she refused to say honor and didn't say obey. And they're just, so these are famous. Lucretia Mott, some of these people, if you have done any work in women history. But anyway, this hangs over my office in my entire life, and I thought I'd brought it for you. The Mennonite, on the very right, there is the Mennonite issue of Marilyn Miller being ordained. In the middle is just a paper copy from the MLA where Justina Neufeld is pictured as in attendance at Mennonite Biblical Seminary in the church vocations program that was going on then. It was really designed for single women to be in full-time Christian service, and Justina is one of those people. Annalie Neufeld, people that, Clausen from Emmaus, Virginia Clausen. So some of these people are common from our area. The three books in the center are the three books we'll be talking about in our presentation. And there is one male that will be on the table there, and that's John Eson. I'm going to have him talk a little bit later. John has been critical in my own life for support and getting me through some sticky situations, but also as an advocate for not only women specifically, but for the office of pastor. How is it to be a pastor? Just incredibly good work, and then also cross-denomination with the functioning of ordination particularly. So I'm going to ask him later on to come and say a few words about what he remembers about working on the issue of ordination for women in the wider church, and he is featured in one of the books, one of the chapters in our book as well. Let's see. 1972 was a violent year. The major news story was the Munich Olympics terrorist attack, where Israeli athletes were murdered by Arab gunmen. How do these things keep happening? The NASA Space Shuttle program was officially announced. There were bombs in Belfast, Ireland. And there were anti-war demonstrations across the nation, drawing 100,000 demonstrators in US cities, Vietnam War. And the Dow Jones closed in 1972 above 1,000 for the first time in history. That is the context of my adult life in terms of profession. Richard and I were in VS from 1969 to 1971 after graduating from Bethel. Dale and Margot were in that same unit. And then we went to seminary because Richard would be the obvious pastor, having been the son of missionary pastor family, and I was thrilled and knew that that's where we would go. So we went to AMBS in 1971 to 74. And I was qualified to be a teacher, but could not find a job, so started doing editing. And then my life has taken a turn in terms of going back to teaching and then going back to seminary. I took some classes at AMBS, but graduated with an MDiv from St. Paul School of Theology in Kansas City, a Methodist seminary. Excellent, excellent experience. And then was called to be the pastor of Manhattan Mennonite Church, go K-State, and was the second full-time pastor of that very young congregation, and just had an excellent experience there. And then was called back to AMBS, where I had been advised not to finish an MDiv in 1974 because what the heck would I do with an MDiv? And the church needed to put its energies into the men of the church. So my counselor, my advisor advised me not to continue in seminary in 1974. And then in 1990, they called back, and I was assistant dean 4 or 5 years, and then called to First Mennonite Church in Bluffton, sort of a sister congregation to this congregation, and just had 8 wonderful years there, and then came here in 2002, late 2002, for conference minister work with Western District Conference. And I'm retired, except I keep doing things too, so it's very good to be here. And thank you for this congregation and its support during these years. It's been impressive. We're going to look at this PowerPoint that we've created. It's brief, but it'll give you an idea about the book that we will sell afterwards for $29. I also have a few copies of my Pastor Wears a Skirt, which I published in 2018, about sort of looking more personally as a memoir. And so we'd be happy to sign any of your books. The book is called Proclaiming the Good News, Mennonite Women's Voices, 1972 to 2006. That black graphic on it was done by Teresa Pankratz. Some of you know her, an artist. Her mother, I think, still lives. Is that right? At Kidron Bethel, or has she passed away? She's been in healthcare for years, but I had no idea she had roots here, but I had followed her work. She did a lot of the work in the MCC newsletter. She was the graphic artist, and I remembered she had some wonderful pictures. When we were going to publish this book, IMS, AMBS, and David Kramer, who was our editor, said, well, get us a photo of some of you women. And I said, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to do something artistic. And so I went through about 200 issues to find a picture that I thought would kind of proclaim the book. Well, I got to press the right buttons here. The first study that was done church-wide, that is MC, can I use that? MC, GC, MB, BIC, Brethren in Christ, and EMC, Evangelical Mennonite Conference. Those 5 denominations combined to do a study of lots of people, over 3,000 people, which at that time represented 70% of those 5 denominations, done by sociologists J. Howard Kaufman from Goshen College and Leland Harder, who at that time was at Mennonite Biblical Seminary in Elkhart. They collaborated with that. And would you believe that one summer we were there, they needed some temporary help in the summer, a typist, to help collect these things. So I literally opened lots and lots of those surveys, sorted them, and worked on the tabulation the summer I waited to give birth to our first daughter. One of the questions that was asked in that study was, in the future, should larger numbers of qualified women be elected or appointed to church boards and committees at the denominational, district, and congregational level? 32% said yes. 1972. Should the policy on ordinations in our denomination, and remember there were 5, be changed to allow for the ordination of women to the Christian ministry? 17%. And do you believe that women in Canadian and American societies are being discriminated against and denied certain basic rights? 16%. That's where I started my career, 1972. Then in 1989, a second survey was done by J. Howard Kaufman again, but Leo Dreger, who's a sociologist from Winnipeg. I'm trying to look here to see if, yeah, they duplicated the exact survey. So this is sociologically good when you look at the, but of course it was years later. And then in 1991, they published the book, The Mennonite Mosaic. And they asked these questions. In the future, should larger numbers of qualified women be elected or appointed to the church boards and committees? Now we're up to 52%. So, oh ye of little faith that people change. Yes, they do. But 52%. And should the policy on ordinations be changed to allow for the ordination of women? Up to 44% in '89. And by the way, we have handouts of the PowerPoints if you need them. And do you believe that women in Canadian and American societies are being discriminated against? We're up to 32% in '89. Both Lois and I were ordained in 1985. This was our environment. What are the responsibilities? This comes from the 1989 study, some of the many pages and pages of graphs and charts. What are appropriate for qualified women to fill? And again, you all know about surveys. Well, what does it mean to be qualified? Well, qualified means not just women, but qualified women. So there's at least think about that. Should they be appropriate? You need to know that the darker blue is the female and the lighter blue is the male. Identical responses, about 75%. Both said, in that sense, yeah, that's a prop. Women worship leaders. Women said 70%, actually men said 72, 73%. Minister of Christian Education. Remember, lots of us were asked in seminary. In fact, my first enrollment there was a Christian education degree. I was a teacher, seemed logical, but and then the churches started calling youth pastors and ministers of Christian education as the first kind of pastoral positions in churches before pastor or associate pastor or co-pastor. Notice women are less read scripture in worship. Youth minister, chair of the church council. Do you see what's happening? Chair of the board of elders or deacons, barely at 50%. Preaching, conduct communion, conduct funerals, ordained minister. Men were more in favor than women. Conduct weddings, conduct baptisms, and conduct ordinations. This is often a pause. What is going on? But if you want to think it through, what has the culture said to women forever? What do these new roles take on if you are in a role that's not, quote, traditional? What have women done in the church that has been honored that is different than this? Often, and it happened in my ministry at Bluffton, no, I am the chair of the women's organization. That's a full plate for me. I can't be a deacon. So the role of women's organizations spawned leadership, identified gifts and traces, but often kept it in the women's fellowship sphere. And those of us who asked or were identified to have graces for leadership as pastor, it was pretty uncomfortable. That would be certainly, probably, except for some of my severest criticism in the early times. We can talk about, we'll have discussion at the end of this. Then in 1993, Renee Souter from this congregation was appointed in her role with the Board of Congregational Ministry for the Mennonite Church to do a study of women pastors. In other words, we heard from the wider church, men and women. Now this was a survey just of women pastors in the United States and Canada. And at that time, that's 1993, there were 186, and we got 134 to respond. It came with a tea bag because it was 20 pages long. And it said, please get a cup of hot water and have some tea and take this survey. What did she find? More than a third reported opposition to their ordination within the congregation, but almost no opposition from conference ministers. And I can report that conference ministers in my lifetime were extremely supportive. It was local leaders and congregational members who, one Sunday in Manhattan, I was the senior pastor. I preached nearly every Sunday, and Richard and we all went and set up the chairs in the room and a young couple came in. They were graduate students at K-State in mathematics, and they came to find a Mennonite church, and they walked in, about 20 minutes early. We were still setting up. And he said, that's no problem. So they came in, I welcomed them, and I told them and gave them a bulletin and said we had a few things to do, and, please join us. And the church, 60, 70 people show up. And I preached. And then at the end of the service, he came up and he said, "You didn't tell us you were going to preach." And I said, "Well, yes, this is my role. I'm the pastor here." And he said, "Well, we'll have to talk about this. I'm not sure we'll be back." So that local experience is so important. But it was conference ministers. In my case, Frank Keller here at Western District was really, really helpful. However, if you're the pastor in the 1980s and in a church, you get appointed to committee work at the district and conference level or denomination. People are looking for leadership, and so saying yes to being on a Western District Conference committee went along with being the first of this too, because this was also, but it was always an encouraging thing, and of course, for me, that became also a denominational. I served on Commission on Home Ministries for General Conference from 1983 to 1989, 6 years, and Darlene was my place to stay and comfort and feed for all those 6 years. That's where I stayed every time I came from Manhattan for meetings. It was wonderful. I thank you for that. Meanwhile, there was a huge study done of all basically Christian denominations in the U.S. And they asked I was helped by the design on this survey, asked the same question of Lutheran women, UCC women, Methodist women. And of all denominations, 9 out of 10 felt accepted by their congregations. In some of the, because they're placed, not a call system, appointed system by like the Methodists, it can vary, but they're happy to have a pastor. And in Presbyterian, Mennonite, where it's a call system, if you get called, that's a really good sign that you might have at least some support, and those who don't want you just don't show up anymore. And fewer than 10% thought about leaving. It gets hard. And all seemed committed to pastoral leadership. Half or more of American male and female clergy felt accepted, energetic, and comfortable. I dug a little deeper into that study, and men had as much trouble in some congregations being accepted for whatever reasons. Some, they wore sandals instead of shoes. Some had beards. Some didn't wear a tie. Clothing is one of the huge issues that face professional people. The next study was done in 2006. However, this was done by Conrad Carnegie, and again, it was a church-wide. This was, again, I have to be careful here. The study was only, this book, Roadsides, is only the MCUSA part, but they did survey Church of the Brethren and Brethren in Christ, too. So it was MCUSA, but the book, which maybe you've all studied and read about, and we've done workshops on, is the report just of the MCUSA. And here they repeated only one question from those first two. Do you favor the ordination of women? You notice that in 2006, it's up to 67%. So there's significant change. There was an oversample of racial ethnic pastors in this study that Carnegie did that had a 71% approval of ordination. And then there was a sample of just pastors, men and women, and got to 76% favoring ordination. So this is in 2006. And this is the frame from our book. So it'd be interesting, just as a throw, with the realignment that's happened in the last 5 to 8 years, the loss of some conferences, the withdrawal of many congregations, it would be interesting to ask the same question now. I would venture we might get higher than 76 due to the fact of the withdrawal of some of the most conservative conferences and churches, but I've been wrong before. Lois? It's just use it down here. Oh, okay.
So this is our book that we have many, many contributors to, and you will notice this is the first part of the table of contents. Dorothy and I wrote some chapters, but we had lots of other people who contributed to this book as well, including John Esau, who you'll see there in chapter 5, together with Nancy Kaufman and Karen Martin Zimmerly, all people who worked with ministerial leadership at the denominational level, wrote the chapter on women's ordination. And then here is the last half of the table of contents. So you can see there is a chapter on surveys that Dorothy was talking about. I have a chapter there on women doing theology and the kinds of theology we did, women moving into church structures, and a chapter on women's organizations themselves. And then you can see what we said in our conclusion. And then finally, very importantly, there is an appendix. And this appendix includes every ordained woman in Mennonite Church USA and Mennonite Church Canada who was ordained between 1972 and 2005. Except for two. We're still correcting some errors here. But there's over, I think, 300 women who are listed there, so you might find the name of somebody you know in that list. Their names and what congregation they were part of and the conference in which they were ordained, and a study guide. Some simple questions there so that if some groups want to use this as a study book, they can. I know there's a group in my own congregation that's doing that. Well, what did we learn as we did this book? I know I learned quite a bit from the people who contributed to this book. One of the things we learned is that context makes a difference. I mean, I knew this, but this was really reinforced in this book, that we, even within the U.S. and Canada, we come from many different contexts. And that makes a difference in how women are perceived, how women are included in church leadership. And I learned some things about the ways we've been doing theology. I mean, one of the simplest ways and one of the early ways that people did theology around the issue of women in ministry was to look back in the Bible at prominent women, or to look back into church history at prominent women, like I did today in the sermon. But that was really just one way of doing theology. The one that I think really gained a lot of traction during this period was what I call trajectory theology, which is, you see what direction that the Bible is moving. Within a very patriarchal culture, Paul had women as leaders of house groups. You can see the direction that things are moving. And so what would be the next step for us in our culture to keep moving in that same direction? Gail Gerber-Kuntz is one who's done a lot of writing on this. In the 16th century, the scripture passages that supported women in church leadership depended on inspiration, on being spirit-filled, on the called by the Spirit. But that kind of use of women in the church did not last long in a very patriarchal European culture, because women were not included in the structures of the church. And as the church began to have more structures and was more institutionalized, kind of reverted back to a more patriarchal culture. I think what's different in the period that we cover in the book is that women were incorporated into the structures as well. It was not dependent on kind of ad hoc inspiration, but also women were in the structures. And another thing is that just to realize the sheer numbers of women involved. At one point, we started trying to count, I think, all the different people who had contributed to the Women's Concerns Report of Mennonite Central Committee over the years that it was being published. I think we gave up on that. But it was hundreds and hundreds of different women from across the continent who were involved in this. And it's not just women who were ordained, but women who were involved in all kinds of church leadership. And then finally, we realized that the struggle's not over. There are many congregations, still Mennonite congregations, who have never had a woman as a pastor, who feel uncomfortable around women in these kinds of roles. And so we are still in some ways, we're still working for women's inclusion in the church. So we want to open it up now for a time for discussion. And I think first John Esau is going to speak.
Is this on, Ben? John, please come forward. Just to say, John really carried a heavy load when he was at the denominational level ministerial office. But I asked him to come and say a few words. Why was ordination such a big deal? Why did you grapple with it? Why did you stand up there and take it for women?
That's saying perhaps more than I knew about. And, well, first, let me say a word of appreciation for the opportunity to be a part of this project. I feel deeply honored that as a male, I was trusted to write about ordination and the ordination of women in particular. I was impressed with the context question. This did not happen in a vacuum. It was an era in which this subject was widely discussed and debated in the larger Christian community. One of the stories that I wanted to tell, and the copy editor at the Institute of Mennonite Studies took it out, but it was about an event in the early 70s of the ordination of 11 Episcopal women, all in one event, the Philadelphia 11. And it was you can still read about this on the internet today. The context of this subject was not just in the Mennonite world, it was spread more widely. This context was also the time of a great deal of questioning of a lot of issues of authority. It was the Vietnam era. It was the Civil Rights era. And all the questions that those things raise are part of what is behind the question of why this question is of significance. The question of challenging authority was a part of that, and the question of challenging the ordination was a part of that. There was, within the Mennonite world, some people tending to want to minimize the whole idea that anyone should be ordained. I was present at an event where John Howard Yoder was speaking, and he said something to the effect that if one is ordained, everyone should be ordained. And if you have him proclaiming something like that, you can believe that somebody's going to try to carry that out. College Mennonite in Goshen tried to carry that out. In fact, you read Nancy Kaufman's story of her ordination in here. It's an amazing account of where they ordained everyone in the church, probably except the pastor, and quickly realized that that was not working. Ordination, what is ordination, is one of the key questions, at least in my mind. And that question was under discussion as a part of this era. Did it mean something? If it meant something for men, it must mean the same thing for women. One of my concerns in working on this chapter was that we must not write two definitions of ordination, one for women and one for men. They must be the same. And that's part of what I was committed to. One of the strategies of writing this chapter was looking at various documents dealing with the question of the ordination of women. And in 1962, C.J. Dick at our seminary, who was a very progressive leader, circulated among the faculty a discussion around the questions of ordination. What does this mean? What are we doing? In his document asking these questions, there is no reference at all to women. Nothing. There's reference to the brothers and to the brotherhood, suggesting that in 1962, the year that I graduated from seminary, there was still nothing on the agenda suggesting that we could move toward ordination of women. That changed dramatically over the course of the next few decades. Alvin Beachy from our congregation here during his time when he was a member here and on the faculty at Bethel College, wrote a paper at the request of the Western District Conference. Does the Bible support or oppose the ordination of women? And of course, he answered the question in the affirmative, that it supports that. There are numerous other documents that reflect this move. Sometimes there was a study conference on ordination and ordination practices in the Mennonite Church, MC, in which they concluded their whole report with a footnote to ordain women. One of the distinct happenings was a document led by Jacob T. Friesen of our community here for the General Conference that was brought to the General Conference that suggested that there is no basis in race or sex, or there were a few issues, but those two are important. That document was adopted by the entire denomination. That put us a step ahead on the issue, and I'm convinced that that strategy was very important. The Mennonite Church decided to deal with the ordination of women conference by conference by conference, which meant you had continuing controversy around the question. The other interesting part for me was the backstories that I discovered. Stories that suggested that women might be ordained. Very early in the 20th century, in about 1906, Annie Funk, the missionary to India who was killed in the sinking of the Titanic, she was ordained as a missionary. And another piece of this that I discovered in my own life was the fact that Mennonite pastor church planters were considered missionaries. And if you were a missionary, your spouse was also ordained. So I have in my possession an ordination certificate for my mother, which I am exceedingly proud of. It was not something she ever claimed, and I never knew about that as long as she lived. I discovered it after her death. But she was ordained as a Christian worker together with my father, who was ordained as an elder at the same time. That certificate is signed by the two most fundamentalist church pastors, Ebenezer Mennonite Church and St. John's Mennonite Church in the Bluffton, Ohio community. And so that was one of the backstories, and there are several other examples that I could talk about of backstories of early attempts to deal with the question of ordination of women that helped to lead us to this great era that's covered in the book. There's no doubt in my mind, but that list at the back of the book of 300 Mennonite women that have been ordained represents a generational change. That is a major generational shift from the attitudes reflected on your data of the sociological studies. We have made a major shift that will not be undone. So, well, that's probably enough.
We have about 10 or 15 minutes for just general discussion, reactions, comments, experiences. Nathan has a microphone. I want to say maybe one of the things that the topic that we have heard most about is the current study that's being done by a couple of women about women pastors and their experience now that deals with the question of abuse. All of us would confess that we suffered abuse in our lives as pastors. In every place I served, there was some egregious things that happened, and I didn't know how bad it was. The culture simply assumed that power was in the hands of men, and I respected scholars and teachers and friends and church members. They were my support. They were writing my paychecks. And it was profoundly disturbing as it became clearer and clearer, some very difficult situations. We must not give up safe sanctuaries. We must not say that it can't happen in the Mennonite church, or that we've dealt with it and we have it figured out. It's a continuation, and women will need to be secure in their identity and in their calling and in the policies of the church in order to continue in the ministry. The biggest issue I hear from young women is, I wouldn't dare be a pastor. You can't please all those people. They're critical. You don't get paid much. You have to work 24/7. I mean, the list goes on. But the issue of personal safety is huge. And so I just want to share that even though we acknowledge we are kind of in an early phase, we know that it was already documented in the studies that in the teens, 17%, 18% of the women responded that they had experienced inappropriate and sexual abuse as a pastor already in our survey. Just to say, why stay in the church, Lois? Why are we still here?
Because we love the church. Even though as I say in the book, I think some of my most depressing times have been because of the church, but also some of the best times because of the church. And I'm still here.
Yes, there's a question. Please use a microphone simply because thank you.
Thank you, Tim Hodge, 2727 North Main, North Newton, Kansas. What are the ingredients that move the needle from the 16% up to the 50 and things like that? And what's going to take us further?
We'll take a shot at that. Well, certainly the culture shifted too. I mean, we are contextual people. These churches are not immune from societal changes, policies, titles, voting. The voting, the Equal Rights Amendment was passed in 1972. Now you realize it hasn't gotten through, but it was passed in 1972. So there were sociological, legal changes, there were policy changes, and there were congregations that said, well, we'll let you do this, but not this. There were some women who were ordained but could not preach, which is but they were in leadership. They led worship, or they were the chorister, or they were the minister of Christian education, which, by the way, shapes children, a significant ministry. Colleges changed, education. There were women's studies programs, things like that. But it's a mixture of things. And then there were successes in terms of women who were given an opportunity, who were accepted, who men leaders said, this is a qualified person. And when I was conference minister and was sent, to churches, I took the names off of the profile. And you couldn't tell whether it was a male or a female in one church, because they told me, don't even bring a woman's thing. We're not. I said, fine, but I'm going to bring you what I think is the best fit for this congregation. There are 3 files. Turns out, they looked at that one and said, gee, that one sounds pretty good. And then I revealed it was a woman, and they said, I didn't think there was anybody who was qualified to do that. I mean, just sort of like, We've never had it. How can we be the first one? And then it'll be in the papers, and we'll be labeled. And I said, well, it's labeled already that you're not. So, anyway, just to say, what other things?
I think the other thing that happened was people got used to women being in church leadership. In my congregation, there was a man who came to me one day and he said, "Oh, Lois, in my head, I think that women pastors are wrong. But in my heart, I know that you are my pastor." Another question.
This isn't a question. It is a reflection of what happened in this church. Frances Funk asked me to be an usher. They had never had women ushers. I was the first woman usher in this church. And it was in the late 60s, early 70s that happened. And I went on and I stayed with the ushering, and then we moved into, and we were youth group sponsors and stuff. And so that's how we got the youth all involved in being ushers. And I ended up being the head usher at one point. So, you know, it was different in the early, even in the late 60s. And so now anybody who wants to be an usher can say, let me do it. I haven't done it for a long time, but I trained all the high school kids at that point, and those high school kids are not high school kids anymore.
This is Heidi Regier-Kreider. I think another factor in the movement is as we develop models of women in ministry that gave more women something to see, to be able to visualize and imagine that could be possible. And I just want to say, to offer such a debt of gratitude to women like Dorothy and Lois and others from those early eras that gave women like me possibilities to see what it might look like, and colleagues and mentors. And also grateful to people like John Esau, who from positions of leadership and authority and policy setting in the church also invited and envisioned that possibility, that tremendously important. So.
This is Miriam Knopfsinger. 2 observations. My first husband went through seminary at AMBS from 61 to 65. During that time, I was finishing nurses training, and Bertha Harder was teaching a class for women on how to be a preacher's wife. That was the extent of the class. So, but in the meantime, my mother was already a deacon at the Meadows Mennonite Church. So, kind of interesting contrast.
I'm wondering, in the statistics you've compiled through the various surveys, whether the voices of women who've left the ministry are represented.
In a simple answer, no, for a couple reasons. One is it was only a survey of women who were active. The reality is we both know a significant number who are no longer in ministry. There are some of us who know people who went to other denominations who were more accepting, affirming of women, and certainly queer women have had nearly no option, even though many of us worked with them in the 70s in the Mennonite church, and then when they came out, they left or were booted out, depending. So it is what it is in terms of who answered surveys. That's the data we have.
I have two little stories to tell. One is about Tina Block Ediger, my stepmother. Let's see. My mom died in 74, and in 75, my dad married Tina. And one of the stories she told is that at one point, my dad, who worked at Prairie View, had asked her if she would want to come and be his secretary. And she piped back, "Well, why would I want to be your secretary when I have my own secretaries?" And my dad learned a lesson there, that things are changing. And so after they got married, a year or so later, he encouraged her to take assertiveness training. And she learned to voice her opinion with strength at the General Conference headquarters, and learned to actually take up battle with a couple men who were really a thorn in her side. And they tried to put her down, and she, through that assertive training, she became a spokesman. And so I think in the end, they all learned something.
We thank you for your attention and care for this. If you want handouts or books, please come forward. We're going to end with a prayer that we have in the book that Renee Souter published. We have also a poem by Raylene Heintz-Penner in that same chapter. Raylene's poetry begins the chapter on women, surveys and conversations. Women pastors speak. The title of the poem is "The Preacher Has Breasts." What page am I on? I'm on chapter, where? 6, page 132. And Renee Souter, who we worked with, she chose not to do writing, but she submitted this as, and John, I think, had a copy of this too. A prayer for ministers. Let's conclude with that. O living Christ, in each of us, you come to meet us. Behind the steady pace of our lives, beneath the noise and detail, you dwell within us. Here we find the interior peace and rest of your presence. Here you bid us enter to quench our thirst for all that is holy in life. For your constant presence, we give you praise. For your constant guidance, we give you thanks. And for your love and mercy without ceasing, we lift a song in our hearts. Engage us, O Lord, among all the signs, visible and invisible, which discover your presence among us, so that we can enter into this day empty of our pretensions, unafraid of our fears, alert to every new possibility. Empower us to give your heart's love generously to all who need us. Help us to honor the goodness in others, to put our arms around the sad ones that they might be comforted, to enter into the suffering of others, to speak the prayers and do the deeds that befit our vocation as ministers and servants of your church. Grant to us the power to speak your word faithfully, that the good news of your gospel may prosper in us and through us. Let it be your instrument of holy discontent wherever the world is unjust or calloused against your mercy. Make of it a herald of your kingdom, speaking for the authority of your promise, that your word, having gone forth with power, will not return to you empty. Thus may we be good witnesses to your gospel, for which we daily give thanks. In your presence, let us be strengthened for the tasks to which you have called us. Praise be to you, Lord God, who awakens us to this new day, filling us with grace overflowing. Amen. 1990. Thank you.